Professor Ronald Frankenberg was born in 1929 and is the author of a number of books, best known among them books such as Village on the Border and Communities in Britain, and has worked as an anthropologist in Africa and teaching in England. Ronnie, how was it that you first became, if you admit to being an anthropologist, how is it that you became an anthropologist?
Well, I came to Cambridge to read medicine, and I did the first 2 years of the natural science tripos with the intention of doing biochemistry in part 2. But I was told my maths wasn't good enough for chemical microbiology, and I looked around for something else to do, and it so happened that in comparative neurology we read a book by Sir Grafton Elliott Smith called Human History, and the second part of this book, which is about the diffusion of culture, struck me as rather unconvincing, and so I found the anthropology library and I read Herskovit's Man and His Works and Kroeber's Anthropology, perhaps not every page, but a bit of them. And so when I was left at Cambridge, with having to stay here a year and nothing else to do, I decided to do the anthropological and archaeological tripos and to concentrate on social anthropology. During the course of doing this, I came across, I specialised in what's called East Africa. The teachers then in Cambridge were a very strange collection of people who mostly knew very little about anthropology as it is now thought of. But the one exception to this was John Pestiani, and so I did East Africa so as to have John Pestiani. Evans Pritchard had just stopped teaching here. And during the course of this I read Gluckman's paper, Analysis of the Social Situation in Modern Zululand, and I was very impressed with this because he seemed to know about both Freud and Marx, which not many anthropologists that I'd met had. And he came to speak to the Heretics Society on the same evening as there was a meeting of the Anthropology Club, and I chose to go to the Heretics. I can't remember who the anthropologist was that I missed. And afterwards went up to him. And very characteristically, he said, "Oh, come and join Phyllis Dean and I for coffee in the University Arms." And that's where I went and talked about this paper of his that I'd read. And then later in the year after I'd got my degree, I decided to give up medicine. I'd never really wanted to do medicine, but in my family it was considered if you went to university at all and did medicine. And I asked, some time afterwards, after I persuaded my father and various other people, I asked Max if I could go as a postgraduate to Manchester. And he had me interviewed by Wycliffe Brown, and Wycliffe Brown said, yes, he ought to take me because the subject needed more people with degrees in chemistry. And I really got a degree in chemistry, but I had done organic chemistry. And so I went to Manchester.
So that's how you went into PhD anthropology. You've talked about Pestiani and Max Gluckman. Which among the anthropologists alive or dead do you think influenced you most?
Oh, clearly Max Gluckman. I mean, no one could work closely with Max Gluckman without being influenced one way or the other. As you may know, I've recently edited a collection of papers in his memory of anthropological work in Britain, and I found when I wrote round to people, no one was indifferent. They either said, he was such a menace, I don't think he should be remembered in any shape or form, or else they said they would write a paper, although of course a lot of people who said they would didn't in the end.
What sort of man did you find him back then? Because you worked in the department, didn't you, for some time?
Yes, I can't remember how many years, but it was certainly a long time. He was very autocratic. He told you what he thought you ought to do and what you ought to write, and got very annoyed if you didn't do it or write it. But his anger in that kind of situation never lasted very long. He was also very meticulous, and when I wrote Communities in Britain, I gave him a typescript late one afternoon about 5 o'clock, and he phoned me up at 8 o'clock the next morning and said, "I've read your typescript. Will you come to the house so as I can discuss my comments with you?" And I think most people who were his close students have that kind of story. I mean, he was absolutely devoted to the subject and determined that people in his department should produce good work, and was prepared to put a lot of work into that.
You never had any altercations?
Oh yes, yes indeed. In fact, well, my biggest row was in 1952. I did master's degree by examination and thesis. Max insisted, if he could, on everyone doing examinations. And I did Roman law. There were 5 papers, Roman law, and 4 papers in anthropology, 3 of which were on northern Rhodesia, and the other one was kind of open. And I answered, well, the questions were in the answer 1 or more, and I answered just one question which I'd been working on, which was on the reasons for the family structure of the West Indies, which was a very fashionable subject at the time. And on the strength of this, Max persuaded the Vice-Chancellor of Manchester, who was also the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Nuffield Foundation, to give me a grant to go to the West Indies. And I got permission. I was going to St Vincent. I got permission from the administrator of St Vincent to go there. But Max tended to sort of gild this kind of lily, and he wrote to the governor of the Windward Islands, whose investigations were perhaps more thorough, I don't know. And the result was, after some confusion, I arrived in Barbados, where I was met and feted by the colonial secretary, who was a former pupil of Max's, a former colonial official in northern Rhodesia. And then the next day deported. And well, it took some time for the sort of legal things to go through. So I arrived back in England a fortnight, no, a bit, I think it was 3 weeks, because it took a fortnight to get there on a rather slow French liner, and 9 days to come back on a banana boat, which went much faster. And so I came back, and Max said, "What couldn't you have done?" So I said I was secretary of the Socialist Society. So Max said, "Well, I'd no business to be messing with politics if I wanted a career in anthropology." And I pointed out, since he was the president of the Socialist Society, I thought it was all right. But there was then a kind of non-interview with the Vice-Chancellor, in which the Vice-Chancellor interviewed Max, and I was left in an anteroom in case I had to be asked any question. And the upshot of it was that I could keep my university studentship on condition that I did my fieldwork within a day's drive of Manchester, so that if I dropped any more bricks, my supervisor, Miss Max, could come out and rescue the university. So I immediately went off to Wales, which was the only place which spoke a foreign language within 60 miles of Manchester, since in those days it is considered terribly important. Anthropologists should work through foreign languages and learn them slowly and painfully. And while I was in Wales, I wrote a letter to the Observer saying what had happened. And this caused enormous fury to the Vice-Chancellor of Manchester and to Max, because they said I had betrayed the university. And I had a series of letters from Max, and the first one, in about 4 days, and the first one said, "Dear Mr. Frankenberg, I am extremely annoyed at your behavior and your ingratitude." And the second one said, "Dear Frankenberg, I am still very annoyed but have decided not to ask the Vice Chancellor to cancel your studentship." And the fourth said, "Dear Ronald, you must really learn to be more responsible." And the last one said, "Dear Ronnie, all is forgiven. Best wishes, yours ever, Max." It was very characteristic, actually, of the way he kind of flared up and got very angry, and then with a lot of, he lived in a sort of very social world, and all these kind of decisions and letter writing and some was done in a very public way. He would always dictate his letters with his staff and students sitting around, put in parentheses. He would ask them, "What did you think I ought to say that?" And people would say no, and then he would put in a parenthesis in a letter to EP and say, "Van Velsen says I oughtn't to have said this, but I still think I should."
Which you were part of that famous Manchester school. Were there any others there who influenced you a great deal?
Well, yes, I think, see, you had to remember that we had no undergraduate students, and we spent literally all our time, 5, sometimes even a 6 or 7 day week in seminars, and that anyone who came back from the field was expected to give 3 or 5 papers, which we would then discuss as a group, so that one was really very much influenced by everyone. But very close influences were Peter Worsley, who was a sort of Marxist hero, and Vic Turner, who was also a Marxist at the time, but in the process of moving out.
What sort of man was Turner?
One really mustn't say people were very human. He's very involved, and very, very concerned to pursue problems to the limits of analysis, so that when he was reading us papers on the Denver, at first they were completely unintelligible because they were all in Denver. And then they were unintelligible in a similar but different way to Meyer Forsch's was sometimes, because he used so many metaphors. But whereas, in my view, Meyer tended to multiply metaphors for the fun of it, Vic didn't. He'd been a poet, actually, before he was an anthropologist before the war, and he always chose his words very carefully. And if you said, "Why do you use," to take a Freudian example, humour instead of wit, he would then talk for 10 minutes explaining why he'd chosen that word and not the other. And in fact, for him, I think this kind of seminar was very useful, because it became apparent to him the degree to which he was using his own kind of linguistic shorthand when the rest of us couldn't understand what he was trying to say.
Did he and Gluckman understand each other? Did they get on?
Oh, very well, yes, very well. I mean, everybody quarrelled with Gluckman at some time. I think perhaps Vic less than most, but Gluckman would often invite you to his house for a supervision or for a meal, and you usually found yourself weeding the lawn or pruning the roses or doing something like that. Or walking with him around the golf course. I had one supervision much later from Max, and I was working in Southwell on the Porthcawl golf course. Max was practicing, I was running along beside him. And people quite often resent it, particularly if they were, as most people were, older than I was, and being officers in the army or other services. They didn't sort of take kindly to the way he treated everyone, all his students as children. The wives all disliked him, because he would quite arbitrarily sort of phone up and insist on members of the department going to his house or going somewhere with him in order to discuss some intellectual problem, but also to collect some timber for something that was building.
Yes. Maya's wife said that this was a problem when she went out because she wasn't usually invited to football matches when Maya was forced to go along. Turning from Manchester to your field work, now you chose Wales because it was a day's car journey and spoke a foreign language.
That's right, that's right.
So you're a sort of English version of Malinowski being imprisoned in the Showgrounds, or Vera Heimendorf being imprisoned in central India by the British authorities.
Yeah.
What interested you most about village and the border? What struck you?
Well, Manchester had very peculiar regulations, and once you had fixed a final title to your thesis, they wouldn't let you change it. And I'd fixed mine, and it was family and community in the West Indies. They agreed to change it to family and community in North Wales, but they wouldn't change it beyond that. So that what I went actually to study was the effect of unemployment on family relations now in a Welsh village, because that's what I was going to study in the West Indies. And so the choice of village was partly based on this, and I chose Glencerrig because all the quarries there had closed down, and all the men either had to be unemployed or travel into England to work. So that was my original focus. But then I got interested in the way in which the kind of situation between men and women that was created by the women spending nearly all their lives in the village and the men only sort of sleeping and eating there in the morning and evening, what kind of effect this had on other institutions in the village. And the most prominent one was in fact the football club at that time. And so I got interested in this, and this fitted in fact, with interests in the department on rituals as ways of focusing and partly diffusing, partly making worse social conflicts which already existed. Although Max would never allow football to be called ritual, he insisted that ritual had to have a transcendental element, and this kind of thing which psychoanalysts and others call rituals, he always insisted that we called ceremonials.
What was your main finding about the role of football in that village?
Well, I suggested that there was a sort of cycle of activity which formed the focus of village life for a period of time, but that during the course of each activity, all the conflicts between families and individuals which had built up over the years came to focus on this activity until it became impossible to continue this activity because there had been so many quarrels and so many people had walked out and refused to come back. And I suggested that in the process of each of these activities folding up, new activities were born. For instance, in this case, what happened was there was a football club which consisted entirely of men, and a supporters club which consisted entirely of women. And the job of the supporters club was to make money for the football club, and they did this by holding an annual carnival. And by the time I left Glencerrig, the football club no longer existed, and the focus of activities was the carnival. And before that there had been a brass band and a choir which had each lasted a few years and then faded out in this way. And I suggested that every time this happened, the villagers organized things in such a way that someone who was in some senses an outsider would move the final resolution which broke things up, so that they were always able to say that they could run things perfectly well if it hadn't been for these strangers who came in. And sometimes these people were complete outsiders like me, and sometimes they were just
Did you ever move the final resolution?
Oh yes, on one or two occasions I was used in this kind of way without realizing until long afterwards. I mean, one just became sort of frustrated with the fact that, you know, things weren't happening, and so you thought you saw a compromise answer, and you suggested something that might be done, and that immediately united everyone against you, and then the activity collapsed, and everyone went round for a few days saying, and Frankenberg had to come here, we could get on happily. It wasn't just me, there was also, I mean, you didn't have to be as much an outsider as I was. For instance, a very popular committee chairman was a Methodist, because most people were Baptists. So that at any rate, if you quarrelled with him, it didn't cause trouble in the chapel. And there was also a local Catholic landowner who was used in the same way.
Can I ask you finally, what advice you would give to young anthropologists of the future who are setting out or advising them on what is the most exciting thing to do in anthropology now?
Yeah, you know, people at this conference, for instance, have been worried about the role for anthropology, and suggesting that, I think Peter Riviere said, you know, the importance of comparison with the other, without, I think, realizing that this kind of approach I've been talking about, in terms of looking at people's ritual behavior in a very broad sense, is something which most sociologists never think of doing, and which often tells you much more about society. For instance, Abner Cohen's paper on the Notting Hill Carnival, I think, tells you much more about the nature of life for West Indians living in London than quite a lot of detailed survey studies that have been done. It may not be better, but it's different and interesting.
One of the advantages he had, obviously, was that he had worked in Israel and other parts of West Africa, and you yourself had a job in Africa for a while, in Zambia. Do you think, did you get a sense when you first went, and before you'd been abroad, despite your short trip to the West Indies, a sense of strangeness and otherness when you went to your Welsh community, just by virtue of the fact they spoke a different language? Was that enough?
I think it was by virtue of the fact that they spoke a different language, but I mean, they lived a very different life from the life that I'd lived up till then in London, or in Cambridge, or in Manchester, or in Devon, which was the other place right there.
Did you get a feeling of studying another culture?
Well, culture was a dirty word in those days, but I was certainly didn't have difficulty in convincing myself that I was looking at a different kind of social system with different kinds of social processes going on. I have more difficulty now, actually. I mean, in Italy, I often feel that, oh my God, you know, what am I going to say about the medical beliefs of the Italians, which are only different from our own, although there are some differences.
Could I ask you about that, because that's your current work? What are you doing?
Well, yes, I got into medical anthropology because a long time ago, because in the Manchester department taught community nurses and people doing the diploma in public health. And because I was then married to a doctor, also a university lecturer in the medical school in Manchester, and we did a study of traditional healing and general health behaviour in a town in Africa, Lusaka. And from this, I worked out a kind of general theory about how people dramatize sickness episodes, and I wanted to make comparisons between how this happened in pre-industrial society and industrial society.
Could you elaborate that theory very briefly? Is it possible?
Well, yes, I'll try. There are really two parts to it. The first is that any episode of sickness can be seen as three moments: a disease, which is biological changes; an illness, which is what the patient perceives; and a sickness, which is sort of totality of social experience involved not only for the patient but also for the doctor and other people. And our work in Zambia suggested that this whole process could be kind of dramatized in the course of half an hour by ritual healing of some kind. Well, it might take all night if it was a spirit possession dance. And all the relevant actors in a person's life could be gathered round or symbolized in the same way. And I suggested that in a complicated industrial society, this process of dramatization was really spread over a very long period, the whole of somebody's life up to the moment of the sickness episode, so that it's much more difficult to see, and it also involves using a lot of literary material like health journals, health columns, television programs, not only television programs specifically about sickness, but Dr. Kildare and Emergency Ward 10, which all give people ideas of how one is supposed to behave when one is engaged in being sick. So I wanted to look at this in industrial society, but I wanted a society where there was a chance that there were fairly well worked out norms that people could pick from, and because I already knew a little Italian, and because I knew some people involved in the area in Italy, I chose Italy in the hopes that there would be a rather stronger contrast than this turned out to be between how practicing Catholics saw the problem of being sick and how communists saw the problem of being sick, in the belief, which turned out to be correct, that being a Catholic or being a communist in Tuscany is not just a matter of having religious or political labels, but there's a whole culture of behaviour.
How is it that the belief turned out to be correct in that respect, but not in respect to medicine?
Partly because, unlike France, communists go on being Catholics, so that when the very militant communist ex-mayor died during the course of the year, he didn't have just one priest at his funeral but four, and all the leading communists have Catholic funerals, and for First Communion ceremonies, the communist mayor and all the communist councillors turn up. The more ideological don't go beyond the threshold of the church, they just stay outside, but they all put on their best clothes and they all turn up. They all go to the party after. That's one thing. The other thing is that the Catholics don't, I mean, you have to go to a priest to find out that being sick is a sacrament which enables you to share the suffering of Jesus. The general run of the Catholic population are not aware that this is the case until the priest tells them, and then I don't think they take it in, which is not surprising.
You mentioned the difference between Catholic and communist and their lifestyles in Italy. And there is a story told that when a recent, some time ago, when a professor was being elected at a distinguished English university, the electors looked down the list and said with horror, the first three candidates are all Jews, we can't have them, and the next three are Catholics, can't have them, to which one of the electors turned and said, well, you've either got to have Catholics or Jews, not get a good anthropologist who isn't one or the other. In which they elected Professor Meyer Fortes. But I was wondering, we've had a session this morning in which André Bataille talked about the relation between Marxism and anthropology, and you made a comment at the end, whether you had anything more to say about the relationship between Marxism and being Marxist and anthropology.
Gosh, yes.
Because he argued that that the two were separate activities.
Yeah, I mean, at one time, when I began in the business, it was very difficult to be a Marxist and an anthropologist, because if you were discovered to be a Marxist, you didn't get to be an anthropologist. And lots of people. The most famous case, I think, is Cliff Slaughter, who got the only first in Meyer's first year at Professor at Cambridge, and was just told point blank by Meyer that he would support him to the hilt for any job in Britain, but that he wouldn't support him for any field work in the colonial territory. And obviously the situation has changed enormously from that. And when I first joined the ASA, the reason why I feature in all the conferences was because Firth is a very fair-minded man, felt since there was a Marxist in the association, he should be allowed to have his say. But I think that I think there can be a relationship between Marxism and anthropology. I think with Maurice Bloch, actually, it remains to be worked out what it is. But you have to, I think, if you begin with the view that Marxism is about class, then you'll never find a relationship. But if you begin with the view that Marxism is about the relations of production, not only of things, but also of ideology and ideas, I think there's quite a lot to be said, but I think most of it has yet to be said.
Where would you, with 40 years and £1,000,000, in which direction would you move in trying to analyse the relations?
Of Marxism and anthropology? Well, I mean, I don't regard my present study as innocent of this. I mean, that's one of the sort of theoretical tools I have is to ask the question, what are families in Italy producing, what is the health service in Italy producing, but not to produce a kind of vulgar answer that they are producing wage slaves in the case of families, and the commodity health or the commodity drugs in the case of medicine, but rather look at a kind of total range of production, which includes ideology. For instance, how does it come about that the way that medicine operates or a hospital operates produces the same or nearly the same kinds of relationships between the sexes and between classes as families produce? What is there any relationship between the kind of advice that magazines give you on how to stay healthy and the way the family is organized, or the way the health service is organized in Italy? Why do communists, as they do, feel that private medicine is not only all right but very sensible, whereas housing is something that ought to be socially provided? All these kind of questions.
Well, then other things I'd like to ask you over time about whether that led to you being an official of the National Union of Miners, for example. But could we just turn finally to one or two personalities you've met in your career, since their names to our students? Did you actually meet Radcliffe Brown?
Oh yes, in fact, I say we worked together, but my master's thesis was on the role of was supposed to be on the role of the Queen Mother in lacustrine Africa, and RB was the original supervisor. But I very quickly got interested in other things about lacustrine about political systems of the Australian states, and in fact narrowed it down to just one. I mean, it was impossible to do what RB wanted, which was to deal with them all. And he first lost interest and then went away from Manchester because he was only there for a year.
He was at Manchester?
Yeah, well, after he retired, he came for a year to Manchester.
What sort of man was he? He looks like a dry man in his photographs and in his prose.
He was old by then and rather ineffective, and he didn't impress us too much. I was the only actual student, but there were two other people who had staff appointments but were actually students, and that was Freddie Bailey and Peter Worsney. And he gave a series of lectures, and we weren't terribly impressed. Partly because he repeated himself, and partly because most of them were plagiarized from Bury's idea of folk. They had their moments, actually. So when the Professor of Comparative Religion came to the first one, and then Radcliffe Brown, and took very copious notes, and Radcliffe Brown began the second one by saying, "Religion, magic, and other forms of superstition," whereupon the Professor of Comparative Religion very ostentatiously closed his notebook and walked out.
Who else? Radcliffe Brown was at Manchester, and you mentioned Victor Turner. Was John Barnes there?
Yes, John Barnes was there, and he had quite an impact on my life, because much to my surprise, when Village on the Border was published, he wrote a review article in Man, which was sort of thin and yellow in those days, saying that this was a major work which was going to transform political anthropology, and seeing all sorts of things in it that I was quite unaware of there, and this made it much easier for me to get jobs and things after. But John at the time was rather a pluralist, since he was, I think he was Simon Research Fellow at Manchester, reader at LSE, had some kind of appointment in Cambridge, and was actually in Norway. And of course his work on Bremenish networks was a big influence as well.
Yes, your careers in some ways are quite similar in that you both got two hotels, one in Africa and one in, of course you went to Rose Livingston.
No. Well, I was eventually. I was intended to go there, but first of all I fluffed the interview.
Who was that with?
I was supposed to study Lungu. No one had told me this. It was agony, actually. No one told me I was supposed to study the Mamilungu, and there were two jobs and a third candidate who was there to make the thing look good, and the two jobs were supposed to go to Jaap van Velsen and I, and this annoying, not very young man, Bill Watson, who had done a study already at Cambridge, which had been rejected because it was about miners in Scotland. And he came along, supposedly for the ride, but I did so badly in the interview that I was dropped out, and so Bill got appointed. Max made me go to a psychiatrist. He wouldn't give me any more references until I'd gone to a psychiatrist to see if my nervousness at interviews could be cured.
Max himself went to a psychiatrist?
Oh yes, he was, but not this one. It was, the psychiatrist I went to was Max Joffrey, who was a great friend of Max's from South Africa. No, he went to a woman, a psychoanalyst in basically. Got a story about that.
Yes.
Well, after I'd come back from the West Indies, and one of the conditions of my continuing support and being able to go to Wales was I would play no more part in politics. In fact, I did, when I came back from Wales, become active again. And one day I was selling the YCL newspaper outside the Labour Exchange on signing on day, when Max came out of his analyst's house, which was just opposite the Labour Exchange. And so he had discovered me selling Challenge, and I had discovered that he was secretly going to a psychoanalyst, and we we formed a pact that he wouldn't say anything about what he'd seen. And after that, he used to go very early in the morning to Zaneth. After that, he used to come for breakfast every morning because I live very close. I can't remember her name. She's very famous in Manchester.
Yes.
I've noticed that.
Did you know E.P.?
Very slightly. Very slightly. I met him once or twice, but not significantly.
I suppose Malinowski was off the scene.
Yes, Malinowski was off the scene, yeah.
Well, I think the situation there. So, then I'll ask you the last question, which is, if you were starting all over again, would you be an anthropologist again?
Oh yes, certainly. It's been great fun. It's been great fun, and it's enabled me to. I mean, you can take interest in what you like if you're an anthropologist. Anything else I can think of doing would have made me much more specialist, and wouldn't have led to such an interesting life.
Thank you very much indeed.